And I think what we are working on today is in building that capacity. The one thing that distinguishes us substantially, very often we make the comparison that the situations in India and Africa are not very different, especially if you look at it in rural areas. But when you talk to people in Africa, and I'm not sure if we have anybody from Africa here, but you know, when you talk to people in Africa, the clear distinction that they make is that, look, there is a world of a difference between even rural India and rural Africa, because we have a level of comfort with technology, whereas in the case of the African situation, they are decades behind as far as that is concerned. So just creating an environment in which you are able to bring about the change when it is needed, I think is an important step forward, which I'm not saying that we don't need to do things much more aggressively. We do, and there are a number of challenges, but I think it is a good positive step, and we need to be able to recognize that for what it is. To give you another very good example, I was discussing just yesterday or day before with someone, the response in Japan. Again, I don't know how many of you have met Japanese people or have experienced their culture. You know, they are very, very formal people, and while they are one of the most energy efficient in the world, amongst the developed countries for sure, and definitely therefore with amongst the developing countries, they, after Fukushima, when they had a major problem of energy supplies, because again Japan is a highly import dependent country, and they had a very high level of dependence on nuclear power, and they had to shut it down, a lot of those plants. Now they have started restarting it, but they ran into a serious energy problem. And when I visited them about a year and a half or two ago, I was surprised to see that in the hotel in which this particular conference was taking place, everybody was in their shirt sleeves. For the first time in my 30 years of visiting that country, everybody was in shirt sleeves, and the temperature settings in the hotel room were between 26 to 28 degrees Celsius. In an effort to save energy, they went to the extent of saying, again, in Japan, because they also have some severe winters, the toilet seats are heated. Toilets are automized in several senses, and there's a heating that is provided. They went to the extent of looking at the energy consumption in these toilet seats, and the same way as we have our TV systems on standby and we leave it on standby, when we switch off our air conditioner, we don't switch off the transformers, etc. All of these devices are consuming energy, and they actually took a conscious choice to do away with the heating of toilet seats because they had to save. I mean, it was a very small amount in terms of the total, but they had to save that energy, and they tried to identify all of that. So when it comes to a crisis situation, we respond. I mean, similarly, if you look at Tamil Nadu, Chennai, the water situation that there was and the rainwater harvesting regulations that were put in place resulted, and I'm sure some of you over here will have more information, or Rohini will talk about it in the next session. But when there is a crisis situation, we respond, provided you have that capacity to respond. If at that time you start scrambling and saying, oh, I don't have the human resources to run this particular industry or to service this particular industry, and you start creating, you lose 5 to 10 years at that time. So the level of preparedness is not adequate, but it is a necessary condition, and I think we are at least trying to head in that direction.
You don't want to come into a crisis situation and then react.
I agree, but you know, several times it's not in our hands.
I would like to supplement that in the solar effort, Gujarat has really come up. Gujarat has even put on their website what all efforts Gujarat is doing for encouraging solar farms. They have come up with good number of private investors who have, for whom government is making available the degraded lands.
Yes.
And they're setting up those solar panels, and they're doing it in a big way. So this, I mean, this is another good example in India itself where we can say that we are going ahead and we can go ahead in this direction.
Yeah, a large part of the, I think Gujarat commissioned a 600 megawatt solar park a couple of months ago.
Like they have made a solar park, like in first of a kind in India.
Sure. So so there are these steps that are being taken. It sets an example. Other states will follow. They will look at the policies and regulations that have been put in place. How did they attract investments? Because these investments had to come in. And as I mentioned, in the case of renewable energy, the first costs of the investments are going to be very high, and you need to get it right. And there are a number of things that come into play over there. But since we spoke about Gujarat, just again to give an example, and there are several of you who are specially part of the geoinformatics program here, working on various aspects. We did an exercise along with colleagues in TERI in doing an integrated renewable energy assessment for the state of Gujarat. This is very interesting because you have in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in several other states in the country, a very high level of solar radiation. We have temperatures that go up, quite significantly, although the linkage is not all that clear between temperature and radiation, but we'll come back to that later. So we looked at the amount of solar radiation that was taking place in Gujarat. We overlaid on that the wind resources, overlaid on that the water resources that are available in the state of Gujarat, because a lot of the solar there are different technologies. Some of those technologies are dependent on water availability. We looked at the infrastructure that is in place, the roads for transporting equipment, etc., the transmission wires and the grid to evacuate the power, and we looked at where agriculture is important and where agriculture needs to take place, because we don't want to get into a situation of compromising on food. We looked at where urban areas are located, industries located, etc., and on the basis of that did an analysis where we said, where can we place windmills, because it requires a certain footprint area that is available to us. How can you integrate solar in it? You don't want the shadow of the windmill falling on solar panels because it reduces the effectiveness, etc. So very, very detailed analysis of that kind, and it turns out that Gujarat has a renewable energy potential resource, which was a factor of 4 to 5 times higher than what we estimated as the renewable energy potential for the country. I am specifying resource and underlining it because resource does not necessarily mean that all of that is amenable to exploitation, because there are a number of factors that come into play as well over there, and a number of regulations and a number of different entities that would have to come together and work, the agriculture departments, the industry departments, the energy departments, and so on, and each one of them have different priorities that have to be looked at. The financial resources, the investable resources that are available, and to be able to do it in a timely manner. So in Gujarat, we were lucky. There was a lot of data that was available. There was a lot of cooperation from various departments, and we were able to do that very, very well, and were able to say that. But the reason why I brought this up is that in a number of areas, including these lovely statistics that I'm putting out over here, there are a huge number of knowledge gaps that we have, and these need to be filled in. We do a lot of our decision making on the basis of the information that is available to us, obviously. But if you had better quality information and you had better analysis done on that information, the quality of your decision making in every sphere of life, again, improves. And I think that is one area in which a body of this kind can definitely help going forward, because you will be equipped to deal with these, you'll be equipped to ask the right questions. But I did want to mention that Gujarat example just so that you know that push comes to shove, despite the cost dimensions, there are options and solutions that we have available to us. This is another presentation of the energy access problem, which talks about it in terms of the densities of population that does not have access. Sub-Saharan Africa is less densely populated. So you see that India really stands out in terms of number of people without access to either electricity or clean cooking energy on a per square kilometer basis. And if red is the highest density that we are talking about, it is the northern belts, including Nepal and Bangladesh, that have one of the most serious problems in the world that we need to be able to address. These are just some, again, statistics from the National Sample Survey Organization that we tried to put in the form of a graph so that the data becomes more easily understandable. The people that are using in different states in the country different forms of energy for meeting their lighting energy requirements, and as you move to the right, a larger number of people do not have access to electricity, and these are the highly populated states of Bihar, UP, West Bengal, Orissa, etc., that we are talking about. So it also helps us when you have information of this kind to focus your intervention so that you're able to make a much higher degree of impact. Similarly, in the case of cooking, large part of our population depends on unprocessed fuel for meeting their cooking energy requirements. There are over 3 billion people, as I said, that depend on biomass for cooking, and this is how they are distributed, just to give you a global picture at the same time. And in India, there is, apart from the macro figures, if you look at rural and urban India, the disparities are stark. We have not, I spoke about rationing LPG for urban areas. For rural areas, we are not even able to supply that. This Ashok referred to yesterday, indoor air pollution and the number of deaths that take place as a result of burning biomass and inhaling all that smoke, and women and children are particularly susceptible to that. This is projecting into the future. Again, the International Energy Agency did a study on this, and they said that we will be able to bring down the number of people without access to electricity and modern energy forms. Not so much on the cooking side, because remember that between 2010 and 2030, the number of people itself is increasing. We are going to go up from 7 billion to 9 billion. So whatever efforts that we make actually get negated to some extent. But for electricity, there's a distinct impact. But they did an analysis to say that we can, if we meet this target of providing energy access to all by the year 2030, it is achievable, and it is achievable at an average annual investment of about $48 billion. And the point that they were making is that while this investment of $48 billion per annum looks large, it is insignificant when you compare it with the amount of investments that are made in the conventional energy sector, which runs into trillions, by the way. Investment in energy access, of course, let me skip this. So this is the world energy demand and the additional energy demand in the energy access to all case, right? We're talking about a 1.1% increment, and that's because, and I will come to that in just a couple of minutes, of how we define energy access, about how ambitious we are and we think we can be in providing energy to improve the well-being of people. In terms of carbon dioxide, because this is the other thing, even going back to Obama's statement of incremental demand, et cetera, because we have these large number of people. This is the total world CO2 emissions in the year 2030, and if we were to provide energy access to all by the year 2030, it would add another 0.7% to the total CO2 emissions. So it is not this segment of the population that is contributing to the challenges of energy security and climate security. So the key barriers, when we were looking at the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, we said, we need a well-defined focus. When we say energy, access to energy for all, what do we mean? This is a definition which I had proposed, and we have a variant of this which has been accepted. Will create an enabling environment that empowers each human being to be able to access the service provided by energy as per his need in high quality and in a timely manner. Very strange. If I present this to policymakers, and I did present it in Vienna last year, and there was a government official from the Philippines who was there, and he said, fine, it sounds very good. How do I translate it into something which is measurable? How do I go back and report to my parliament, on what it is that I have achieved in this? the reason for suggesting this alternate formulation is that there's one definition of energy access that says provide 30 units of electricity per household. There's another definition that says provide 1 unit of electricity per person per day, which translates, if you take an average household size of 5, to 150 units of electricity per month. So that's 5 times higher. So there are different definitions, again depending on different contexts. So, and then the question comes up, who are we to decide what is a good level of consumption for them? We have said, let's set this as our target because they don't have a voice and, their consumption levels are low, and therefore you are determining to some extent. And when we talk about energy access, we'll come back to that. There are different stages of energy access. But, how do you decide this? So we had a big argument in this international meeting with representatives from the UN and different country representatives, and each one of us had our own perception of what constitutes energy access. And so that was one. Second was our own experience with a program that we were running in TERI on Lighting a Billion Lives, the Solar Lanterns Initiative. There are various ways of providing lighting, but here is one example just to provoke your thought. In this example, we basically set up a number of rural enterprises and gave them solar charging stations. So basically one panel, one little room with a few solar panels on the top and 50 lanterns that could be charged from those solar panels. And these lanterns were then rented out to the people who needed lighting at a cost that was no higher than the cost of using subsidized kerosene on a daily basis. That came to roughly about 2 rupees per night. So what were we doing in this particular example? We were not delivering energy in homes. We were delivering the service of lighting in homes. So why do we talk about energy access only in the terms of delivering a certain quantity of energy in homes? If you were to extend the lighting example, let's say to irrigation, and we say we are not able to provide electricity to a large number of villages in the country, and instead we allow private enterprise at a local level to come up and provide the same service that electricity would have been providing, which is to deliver water for irrigation purposes. And if, again theoretically speaking, they were to have mobile pump sets that they take from field to field and help people to generate the water and distribute it, A, you have improved the capacity utilization, B, you have brought down costs as a result, and C, you have ensured that they have access, and there's one person that is taking care of the supply chain and everything else. Is that doable? Is there another way of looking at how we improve the well-being of people? May work, may not work, may work in certain situations, may not work in other situations. I'm not giving this as a panacea for all. But given the size of the challenge, given the numbers that we are talking about, given the financial resources that are required, etc., we need to be able to think out of the box to come up with very different solutions. And there are ways of doing that. So in this particular definition, and if you look at what the Sustainable Energy for All document talks about, there is a flexibility in provision of energy or in provision of the services that are delivered by energy. This is just an evolution of the concept within the country as well, at an international level really. So let me not go through this in the interest of time, but basically it just goes to the point that definitions have varied, these have evolved. Even in India, I think there has been an evolution, particularly in the context of rural electrification, but this will continue. And once we reach, for example, a certain amount of energy access, at the next level we will aspire for something higher. Yeah, please.
You spoke about social awareness. Ma'am, we people are definitely aware about the solar panels, the wind energy, the renewable sources of energy. Like if you talk about the solar panels, it decreases the carbon emissions to 0.01%. And the wind energy, if we install miniature versions of windmills on the rooftops, it decreases around 0.03% of the carbon emissions. But even though we are very hesitant in installing these systems in our buildings in the normal use, then why is it so?
For a variety of reasons. First is you don't have the service providers. If I want to install a solar panel on my home today, I don't know who to go to. If I want to avail a particular subsidy program of the Government of India, which has been stated, let us say, for solar water heating systems, for me access to the technology is not easy. Today we are talking, and some of you will be working on it as well, a lot about smart grids and smart mini grids. There is a huge amount of, if you look at again the Electricity Act 2003, it talks about cooperative generation, it talks about community based generation. So theoretically, in the place where I live in Gurgaon, 20-25 homes can come together and set up our own generating plant, looking at all the rooftop space that is available to us and everything else, right. And there is a large international company, for example, like Alstom, that is interested in getting into this business because they see that there is a huge opportunity coming up, if not today, at least in the future, and they want to get a foothold into that market. But they are not able to find us and we are not able to find them. There is a gap in the supply chains. So there are, unless the businesses become vibrant, unless the policy framework is supportive in each of these areas and is tangible, is reachable, it is very, very difficult for these connects to happen.
I just wanted to make one point. In this scenario of energy crisis, we are having the enhanced energy mission and all. How do we look at the various politicians or political parties making in their manifestos such promises and even carrying them out, like Mr. Rajshekhar Reddy, he promised free power to farmers, and that led to a lot of over exploitation of water resources, and that has led to going down of water levels to really dangerous levels. So how do we check, and do we have any idea, in future government is working on those to curb these tendencies of unsustainable promises and then carrying them out?
You will have to give me an answer. All I can say is that I spent, along with a few colleagues and the Ministry of Power representatives, a full day in Hyderabad when Mr. Rajshekhar Reddy came to power, talking about the energy challenges and particularly the whole issue of subsidies. And he sat with us for the whole day, but then went and did exactly what he did. So the political compulsions very often override the long-term issues. And I think if politicians who have short lives in the political system are to do the right things as far as sustainability is concerned, the pressure has to come from people. We have to be able to generate that awareness, and we have to be able to change also the mindsets of people, which is not easy because we are all looking at the here and now and not at the long term. Same is true of industry. Industry at one end wants to be there. They don't design themselves to expire in 10 years. They want to be there and they want a legacy. But at the same time, they are reportable to their shareholders on a quarterly basis, which is what we complain about. So how do you reconcile this short term and long term, and what are the mechanisms that we need to put in place? We haven't cracked that at any level, at a personal level, at a corporate level, or at a government level. Sorry?
We have an Energy Act now. Why can't we incorporate such curbing measures?
The Energy Act, you're right, that we put in place, and the whole institution of regulatory commissions that were put in place was largely to create a distance between polity and the industry, the sector. So it was supposed to create an arm's length distance, especially on the pricing issues. And regulators have been given the powers to set prices and to demand that if any government, any state government wants a subsidy to be given to any segment of the population, they should allocate the resources upfront. And it is the regulator's responsibility to ensure that the cost of service is given with an adequate rate of return to the service provider. I don't think there is any regulator in the country that has exercised its powers. Goes back to the issue of selection of regulators, of accountability of regulators, and their ability to actually distance themselves from government. And there are a number of challenges. We can discuss it. We have made various presentations on this subject, but the challenge still remains. And I think the key challenge is on the selection of regulators and the accountability of the regulatory institution.
There is a small point to make over here. As Ms. Bindu Sharma is a very senior forest officer, but the point is we must understand we are working in a certain system, because the democracy and the government, politicians and promises, we can't do away with these things. They are the political class ministers and prime ministers and chief ministers. So if we are into their places, as Mr. Reddy, she is mentioning, he made certain promises. She is mentioning, is there any mechanism to have a restraint into those things to make promise or not? So we have to live with that. A politician has to make promise, and it is different thing after coming into power. He may not deliver. I will give a small point where in Uttar Pradesh, when Akhilesh Yadav government came to power, before that he promised laptop and all those things to the people. But when he took the chair, it was told it will take place, morality and all those things, because it is very easy to make promise and very difficult to implement. But we have to live with this. And politicians or any class, we bureaucrats, if we have to discipline ourselves, we would be the last person to do that. So, and plus these Terry University and Mr. Ashok Khosla study was telling, this process of sustainable development and these, yesterday you mentioned, you people will become
Ambassadors.
leaders and ambassadors. So it is need every individual. Questions were raised yesterday to Mr. Khosla. The answer he gave, it is we have to assert, we have to take the place, because we can't expect anything from the government. So this exercise, each and everybody has to find out into the interiors and everywhere throughout length and breadth of the country. They have to